Hello again, Dan Olasso here, making history. And as I promised, I'm going to start talking about markets and capitalism. This will be part one of a series, I think. So as I was reading the historiographical notes that I had written on the social historians' disagreements over the market revolution, and there will be more historiography posts in the lifelong learning series over time, it occurred to me that I really ought to define what I mean by some of these terms and compare these definitions with what other people have said. And so I promised to do that in a previous video, and this is the beginning of that. And this need kind of became clearer to me when, in his review of Charles Seller's book, The Market Revolution, Christopher Clark said that the word market is too often conflated with capitalism, but should not be. And this echoed something that Michael Merrill had said several years earlier, that historians, quote, universally equate capitalism with what 18th century political economists called commercial society, and take for granted that the expansion of the latter automatically entailed the triumph of the former. Merrill's point in that particular article was that even Adam Smith was anti-capitalist, in the sense that he, quote, sharply condemned the, what Smith called mean rapacity and the monopolizing spirit of merchants and manufacturers, who neither are nor should be the rulers of mankind. So this is an interesting claim, I think. But you can see how it requires a closer look at what these terms really mean and how people use them. What Merrill had called commercial society is probably the main initial focus for me. I've been reading about early prehistoric human societies for quite a while now, years and years, even before I started teaching ancient and medieval world history. I think David Graeber made a good point in his book Debt, the First 5,000 Years, when he said that economists have kind of perverted our understanding of the beginnings of commerce with the myth they always tell about barter societies preceding markets, money, and credit. This is kind of a just so story. There probably never was an Edenic world of sharing and barter, just as there was never a state of nature as it was imagined by Hobbes or Locke or Rousseau. In many of the very earliest archaeological remains that we found objects from far away. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan was found in the royal tombs of Ur in Mesopotamia, which are about 4,600 years old, and in the funeral mask of King Tut in Egypt, circa 1323 BCE, so about 2,300 years old. And this happened the world over. Copper from Lake Superior was found throughout the Midwest, but also in New England by about 4,000 years ago, and the Gulf of Mexico by about 3,000 years ago. And there are too many specimens, up to 20,000 found at thousands of sites throughout North America, to suppose that they were all used by people who had dug up the copper and made the artifacts. So that means they were traded. Now, once we establish that fact, that people have been exchanging things for probably as long as we've been human, the question then arises, when did this type of behavior become commerce? And what does that word mean? I think of it as being related to surpluses. When did people go beyond simple one-off exchanges of things that they needed or wanted in the moment to more deliberate and more planned production of things that they knew other people would find valuable, and production in quantity? And I think this happened very early too, probably even before what we think of as civilization. Imagine a hunter who brought back a big kill to a camp, who had a limited ability to preserve and store the meat. He probably shared it, probably with an expectation that the next hunter who brought back a big kill would share with him, and that the gatherers who ate his meat would share the berries and roots and wild grains that they found. And maybe the craftsperson who made good moccasins from the hide that he gave her would make him a pair in exchange for the leather. Even before writing, people would have been able to keep track of these types of exchanges if they were made with people who weren't part of that most intimate social circle where everything is just shared automatically. Where strangers met, trades would happen that allowed the folks who could find the pretty blue stones, the lapis in Afghanistan, to get grain that didn't grow well where they lived, like the wheat from Mesopotamia. This existence of people who wanted or needed something that you could make, that is markets, would allow you to focus on what you did well, or the resources that you had access to that others didn't. Ancient trade routes are as old as the oldest settlements. We imagine that before people settled down in villages and towns and cities, they had been mobile and had gone where the things they needed were located. Seasonal foods, migrations of prey animals, spring fish runs, that type of thing. When they settled down, people seem to have delegated that travel to people who were good at it. And these folks became caravan traders. So we've established that trade, or commerce, is ancient. But it takes time to carry sacks of wheat all the way up to Afghanistan so you can exchange them for lapis, or for tin for your bronze tools. If the Afghans came halfway, that would surely help. Maybe to a place where people would meet seasonally. So in addition to sort of being understood as the existence of people who want or need something that you can make, markets also became things, places that you could go. And sometimes settlements, either temporary or permanent, would grow around them that were really all about the trade. And the people who then would become kind of professional traders would bring things to these markets. And they would need to be able to keep track of the valuable stuff that they brought to these markets, some of which probably didn't belong to them. And then when they got home, to distribute the proceeds appropriately. And this, of course, was another motivation for people to develop writing. Sometime, probably during this prehistory, people seem to have gotten to the point where the markets contained enough variety of goods that it no longer really made sense to carry a product to every stall and try to exchange it for whatever wares were on offer there at the time. Or your product was out of season, but you still needed to go to the market and get some stuff. Now, there were two possible solutions to this problem: account books and money. And it's impossible to say which came first, but I imagine it was account books, probably, or their equivalent on cuneiform tablets or whatever. You can keep accounts with people if you trust them and if you have an ongoing relationship. So this tends to happen within communities. You need money if you don't trust the people that you're trading with, or if you're never going to see them again. Throughout history, we've had both of these types of commerce, but this hasn't always been fully understood by historians. Even in early America, there is this argument that these books and articles that I've been talking about recently came from, about a market transition, in which some historians argue that folks in upcountry villages, for example, were not doing commerce until some point when they changed. I would contend that they were, but because their communities were small and built on trust, they were keeping accounts. They were granting each other credit. How else was a farmer who wouldn't have anything of value until the harvest going to get through the rest of the year? So now we have markets, we have account books, we have money, and we have credit. These are the makings of an economy. But it's still not capitalism. Capitalism isn't just trade. It's not even free trade, which nowadays it's often imagined to be. But free trade is what you tend to get when there are no constraints on the exchanges that people can make. Why would there be constraints? Lots of potential reasons, ranging from religious or moral ideas about how much is enough, to prohibitions on certain kinds of goods, like pork in Jewish markets, to determinations that something ought to be protected, like maybe the scarce tin that was mixed with copper to make bronze tools and weapons. So capitalism isn't about free trade. It's about the accumulation and the use of capital. This is the thing that Karl Marx thought was so important. He used that one word as the title of his big book. But what is capital? We've already seen how people who have access to markets can do more of whatever it is that they do to create something valuable. And then they can bring it to a market and exchange it for either goods that they need immediately or for credit or for money. What happens when they make and sell more and get more credit or money than they actually need right now? Well, they get rich, right? They have that surplus for a rainy day, either as cash or if they're living in a place where there's trust or where there are good laws, as a credit balance on someone else's account book. Nowadays, we call that a bank. When that excess is sitting in a vault or in someone's bank account, we call it wealth. When that person uses that wealth to increase their ability to do or make something of value, we call it capital. A capitalist is someone who takes their excess, their wealth, their profits, sometimes called retained earnings, sometimes even just their good credit, which is also valuable, and that person invests them into some value-producing enterprise. Now that doesn't sound so bad. How could anybody be anti-capitalist, you may be wondering? The answer is complicated and has a lot to do with the consequences of concentrations of wealth that tend to follow from these types of investments. Also, a sort of sensitive dependence on the initial conditions, and also on the shady things that people sometimes do to win when this activity becomes competitive. And I'll talk about all those things and why it is that Adam Smith was an anti-capitalist next time. But I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.